And so it's kind of familiar to everyone. And I think it's a good herb for any beginner herbalist.
Hello and welcome to the Herbs with Rosalee podcast, a show exploring how herbs heal as medicine, as food, and through nature connection. I'm your host, Rosalee de la Forêt. I created this YouTube channel to share trusted herbal wisdom so that you can get the best results when relying on herbs for your health. I love offering up practical knowledge to help you dive deeper into the world of medicinal plants and seasonal living. Each episode of the Herbs with Rosalee podcast is shared on YouTube as well as your favorite podcast app. Transcripts and recipes for each episode can be found at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com or through the link in the video description. Also in the video description, you'll find other helpful resources. For example, to get my best herbal tips, as well as fun bonuses, be sure to sign up for my weekly herbal newsletter. Okay, grab your cup of tea and let's dive in. Early on in this conversation with Dr. Jillian Stansbury, I had one phrase that just kept running through my mind. This woman is brilliant. It was so much fun to interview her, and every section of this conversation has so much wisdom infused into it. Not only does she give this fire hose of information about chamomile's many gifts, but she also touches on how herbs heal versus pharmaceuticals, and how we may not know exactly how an herb does what it does, but that's okay, and so much more. If you like to nerd out on herbs, then you are going to love this conversation. For those of you who don't already know her, Dr. Stansbury has practiced as a physician in Battleground, Washington for over 35 years and also directs the Healing Arts Apothecary open to the public. She chaired the Botanical Medicine program at NUNM in Portland, Oregon for many decades and remains on the faculty. She leads ethnobotany field courses in the Andes and Amazon each January and is the author of 7 herb books, including the award-winning 5-volume textbook series, Herbal Formularies for Health Professionals, published by Chelsea Green. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being on the show, Jillian. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you, Rosalee.
Well, I just want to dive right in and hear your story of how you became an herbalist, a naturopath, and kind of what brought you here to us today.
You bet. I think like so many herbalists, it was just an intuitive relationship with the natural world that always since childhood, I've paid attention to plants and noticed when they bloomed and noticed the way that the flowers emerged and closed up into little buds, and like to gather dandelions. I couldn't believe people considered dandelions a weed when they were a beautiful flower, and would make braids out of them to make festoons for our heads and to play games with them. I loved walking home the longest way from school through the forest and the ravines. And I think like so many herbalists, just a natural comfort and affinity with the plant world and the forests and the trees and the understory and the tiny bugs and the butterflies, and just called to me like so many of us. I think that I was also blessed to have farm folk as my grandparents. My family had a farm in Iowa that raised corn and soy and potatoes, as well as beef cattle, not dairy cattle, beef cattle and some hogs. And I loved visiting my grandparents and playing in the hayloft and feeding the animals and helping my grandfather survey the land on his tractor. And they taught me things. And like most farmers, they had their own little vegetable garden that I didn't really work too hard. I was, quote, working with grandma or grandpa in the garden, and just learned how things grew and how they saved the seed potatoes. Or when I was on the tractor with my grandfather, I think this is all done mechanistically now, but he would want to save the biggest ears of corn in his seed box. And so there was a little seat for me on the back of the tractor that was a bench that would open up. The top of the bench would open, and that was the seed box. And I was just supposed to look at any corn that was getting shot into the back of this great big bin on the back of the tractor and grab any of the largest, best ones and getting up off my seat and putting them under my bench. And those are just some of my favorite memories that are all just kind of plant-based memories of my grandparents and farming with them, and getting to know the plants and the season of the plants and planting them, and just living with people that lived close to the earth, kind of simple farm life. And then one other influence for me was Girl Scouts. I was blessed to have a Girl Scout team of leaders that would take us backpacking every month. And we would get skills like being able to use our little gas burning stoves and put the tents up and down and pack our backpacks and go on little weekend hikes. And this was to get us skilled and in shape to take a big trip every summer. And those leaders also instilled in me an appreciation of plants, because they would point out all of the plants along the hiking trail. They didn't necessarily know medicinal virtues, but they just loved the plants and would name them as we went by. Oh, look, there's sword fern. Look, there's hepatica. Look, there's some bloodroot coming up. And I adored that. And so I think all of those early just connections with nature led me to have an interest in science and botany and chemistry and biology. And I loved those subjects in junior high and high school. And I considered majoring in botany when I was in college, but ended up choosing just pre-med, but my actual degree was in medical illustration, and that allowed me to fuse my love of art and take a lot of art classes, as well as cover the whole pre-med program and kind of study what I wanted. And it was a special major that I had approved for me through the deans of both the departments of pre-med, science, biology, the BS program, and the art program. And then I did not even know what naturopathic medicine was until my last year of college. I was taking pre-med, as I said, and considering applying to medical school. And I was looking for which medical schools featured a lot of nutrition and healthy lifestyle. And to my surprise, none, or hardly any, or maybe one class in nutrition in the whole medical curriculum. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's not for me. Maybe laboratory science and being a lab tech, or maybe environmental science and going into forestry, or maybe I just love the diagnostic imaging of electron microscopy. Maybe I could do a lab that featured doing electron microscopes, and there's no jobs in that. Or maybe you might have one at each university, but it's not really a viable career path per se. But I was in that exploration of where do I go next? What's my next step when I graduate from this medical illustration program? And I was standing in the school's library, flipping through this book of allied science careers, and opened a page that said naturopathic medicine. And I actually had a mini panic attack, not quite panic, but more like excitement attack. Like, oh my gosh, this is a career, and there's schools and you can get a degree in it, and they have herbal medicine and they do nutrition. And I was just so enthusiastic about it. And I had moved to the Bay Area of California by this time, and was graduating from San Jose State University, and learned that there was a college in Portland, Oregon. So I went up over the Thanksgiving break of that fourth year in college, and was enrolled by the end of that year when I was graduating, to move up to Portland immediately upon my graduation from college. And it's definitely been a good career path for me. I loved the school. I loved the people that I met there. And botanical medicine was certainly by far my favorite subject. And I had such a great affinity for it since childhood. And I took it upon myself just to take all of the electives and read all the books and grow a garden and start to make medicines. Like most herbalists go through that excitement of saving the bottles and the bags and the plant starts and microgreens and growing this and tincturing that and making salves and oils. And really my love of that has never ceased. And at this point in my career, I've been in practice for 35 years. This year is actually our 35th anniversary, and we'll be holding a celebration this summer. But I've cut back on the number of days that I see patients. It was full time, and then it was 3 days a week, and then it was 2 days a week. And now I'm just 1 day a week, and I run my little apothecary in the small town of Battleground, Washington, just about 40 minutes north of Portland, Oregon, where I went to the naturopathic medical school. I set up this little practice, Battleground Healing Arts. I bought the property from an elderly doctor who created it in the 1930s. It's just an ideal little location for me. So I converted what was a one-car garage that was right on Main Street. That was this elderly doctor's home, side by side with his medical clinic. And I converted the garage into a little apothecary and then added a solarium to the front. And the inside of this house, we have a yoga studio and massage suites, and the clinic remains our clinic with other physicians and acupuncturists. And so now really my day-to-day work is more having fun in the apothecary, kind of back to my roots. And we make teas and we make salves and we stock medicines from all over the world. Sometimes we make special products that just don't exist for certain patients. Extracting lobelia into castor oil is what I have going on my shelf right now for a patient with COPD. And just sometimes there's just niche things. I think this would be great. Nobody makes it. Let's make it for this patient. And it remains my passion and joy to be around all the plants. And I think there's also something comforting, almost like the beauty of a wood pile or something once you get it all stocked for the winter. Just the beauty of being around all the herbs, the full jars, and just the vibration that kind of holds in a space, I think is just so comforting. And so I like being in my apothecary, even though I've been in it for 35 years now. I still like being in the apothecary and just around all those herbs. It's really a grounding kind of healing space that it creates. And people walk through the door. Our apothecary is open to the public, and people walk through the door every day saying, "It smells so marvelous in here." And I can't even smell it. I just must be saturated with it in every pore, the way you can't smell things when you're right in it. You have to leave the room and come back. But other people, I think, notice too, just the comfort of being around all those herbs just by walking through the door.
What an amazing resource and place for the folks in your area, just to have a healing arts center. And yeah, and Jillian, I'm reminded, so we have a mutual friend, Jim McDonald, and I was just chatting with Jim yesterday, and I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you for the podcast the following day. And Jim has many fond things to say about you. And one of the things he said is, he says, the thing about Jillian is that she's a naturopathic physician, but she's really an herbalist. He said something like that, she's really an herbalist. And just everything you've just like got on and on about, plants and seasons and all that connection when you were a kid. And then now it's like your apothecary and all of that is just, yeah, you're like, the herbalism runs deep, where that's just not always true for naturopathic physicians. Like,
that's true.
There are many different ways of being an ND, and there's just, not everybody has their own apothecary when they're a naturopathic physician. So
that's true. You are right. Yes. And I'm very fond of Jim myself. So that's sweet of him.
Yeah. He's hard not to love, for sure.
For sure.
All right. So thank you so much for that story. I did not know your story, so it was nice to hear that. And I know that you've taught along the way. I first became aware of you, I don't even remember, maybe 2010 or earlier, down at Cheryl Tilner's farm when she had her conferences, which I have to say, I have so much like nostalgia for those conferences. I can't remember what she called them, but anyway, these gatherings, I don't know. They had such a nice feel to them, and it was just a fun time to go down there. And that's Cheryl Tilner, who's also a naturopathic doctor. And anyway, so that's where I first became aware of you. I took classes with you there. And then in the past couple of years, you took on, which I want to say I'm so grateful for, but what I also consider somewhat of this insane endeavor to create 5 volumes of herbal formularies for health professionals, each volume focusing on a different system. And wow, I mean, these are treasured by so many people in the herbal world. I'm sure with naturopaths as well. Just one of these books, there are, many, there's 5 total. Just one of these books has so much information in them. I can't even imagine, how much time it took to do just even one. I want to talk. I'm so curious, like, where did you get the idea? When did you know it was 5 volumes? Did you realize how much work it was going to be at the onset? At what point did you regret
Right.
it? Again, so grateful for it. Yeah, and also it's published
Oh,
by
thank
Chelsea
you.
Green, which is like my favorite publishing company. Everything they do is so
It's a
cool.
wonderful
So,
it's a wonderful company to work with. I published a couple other small books, and it was kind of a frustration. And working with Chelsea Green was just marvelous. They only made my vision better and helped me polish it up, and were marvelous to work with. But those books were a good 25 years in the making.
okay.
And it really just took 5 years, just 5 years to complete the polishing up process, volume by volume. We basically did one per year for 5 years, but they were all based on my teaching at the Naturopathic Medical School. I was the chair of the botanical medicine program for many decades. I remain on the faculty, but I no longer teach to the extent that I once did. But I had a concept of how to organize the basic volume of material based on that class series. And how we organized the classes were by organ systems. You kind of start with some basic vocabulary. What's an alterative? What's a demulcent? What's an adaptogen? What's an astringent? Like some intro vocabulary. And then we launch into GI is always first, because the liver and the gut are so foundational to health. And then you talk about the common GI complaints, irritable bowel or constipation or ulcers or reflux disorders and hepatitis and gallstones, and teach the materia medica that are some of the most useful herbs for those. And then you go on to another organ system and another organ system. And so that was my concept for the textbooks, was to have 5 volumes that would cover all the basic organ systems: respiratory and immune and allergy and reproductive and skin and cardiovascular and peripheral vascular, endocrine, and so on. And in so doing, each one of those organ systems might have 20 key herbs and 20 other little support herbs. So throughout the books, the herbs might get mentioned again and again. And there is a master index actually available from Chelsea Green. We were thinking about publishing it, and then it was the pandemic, and we never really came back to the concept. But the publisher does have a master materia medica. If you kind of think, well, where did I read that, and which of those 5 volumes? They do have that available. But that system of creating those notes every year, or maybe every few years, I would update my notes that I would give out to students. And so they would get a little better and a little better, or I would anticipate the questions that students would have, or I would have other little recipes that I could add. And I just sort of made my notes better and better over a 20-year time period. However, some years I would use this font, and some years I would have it spaced in this way. So it wasn't really consistent from a publisher context to have everything, like all of the headings the same and all of the styles the same and all of the kind of lengths of discussions and the narratives just all matching. It was all a hodgepodge of stuff. And so that's what took 5 years, just to kind of take my basic note structure and polish it all up. And then it's heavily referenced, as you probably know. And that's important in in alternative medicine, I think because so often people that aren't really in the discipline, one of the main objectives will say, well, none of that folkloric stuff has ever been studied, or none of that has ever been proven, which is definitely not the case. And so I wanted to showcase what research there really was. If it was a clinical trial, I certainly included that. In many cases, there's not clinical trials, but there's animal research, and there's molecular constituent research, and there's just all that research on inflammatory mediators or cancer cell lines. And just to kind of showcase, there's a great deal of sciencey research on these herbs and on treating these conditions. It's not just folkloric old wives' tales. So I really worked hard, and there's thousands and thousands of footnotes in all of those textbooks. And that was probably one of the more tedious or time-consuming things, just to search PubMed and polish all of those kind of supportive documents. If we say it's an anti-inflammatory, where here's studies that say it's an anti-inflammatory, or if it's been shown to improve fertility in women with PCOS, well, here's a study where it did just that, and kind of support, verify, validate so many of the folkloric claims with modern research. And that is time consuming, but it was a labor of love, certainly. And I greatly enjoyed doing it. And I do like to just nerd out on the research. And it's kind of a lazy thing you can do laying on the couch on a rainy evening or something, or in front of the fire. And it's enjoyable to me to write and to organize information and to search out those studies. It's educational and fun.
Spoken like a true nerd. So that explains a lot for me then. So 20 years, you are creating your notes for your classes and improving on them, building on them. So yeah, I just look at this and I'm just in awe of it. And so this explains why it's so amazing, because it's 25 years in the making, essentially.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having that vision and for, teaching, which is always, giving back. And I can imagine that these are probably textbooks that are used in a wide variety of situations now. They're used by herbalists. They must be used in naturopathic schools. And just what a gift to us all that you went through that. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Labor of love.
Well, so I am always excited when chamomile comes up on the podcast, because as listeners know, one of my very favorite plants. And I was especially excited that it was like, I have a naturopathic physician on, and you chose chamomile, because I just feel like it's such a plant that can be like dismissed or overlooked. And I love that you chose chamomile. And I'd love to hear, why did you choose chamomile?
Yeah, I think it's so safe, so gentle, has such immediate efficacy for irritable bowel syndrome and a few gut complaints or nausea that we'll talk about. It's safe to give to children. It's reasonably inexpensive and readily available. You could even go to the grocery store and pick up some chamomile tea, and it would have some medicinal effect for people. And I adore it as well. I always feel good personally drinking it. It's not a powerful sedative by any means, but you can feel a subtle calming effect just after a cup or two of chamomile tea. And that's a great thing in this fast-paced world. Anything that soothes the ragged nervous system. Of course, Peter Rabbit's mother gave it to him and to calm him down after he had a scary escapade. And so it's another one of those plants from childhood that you meet. And so it's kind of familiar to everyone. And I think it's a good herb for any beginner herbalist. But you're right, sometimes it gets overlooked with all of the flashy things from foreign countries, or the adaptogens or the mushrooms, and just things that are cutting edge in their research for neurodegeneration or for new research coming out on this or that. Sometimes we can overlook just those standard culinary herbs or just the grocery store herbs, and really what powerful medicines they can be. So I've used chamomile most as a simple herbal tea. It's not something I've used in capsules, and I really think its best virtues are as a tea, and certainly as a tea if you're trying to treat a tummy problem. And so the recipe that I wanted to share with you, I've been making it the same way the whole time I've been in practice. We just call it our tummy tea, and it's equal parts chamomile, mint, fennel, and licorice. So at this point, we are doing pounds of each, and we mix it in a great big garbage bag and then weigh them out into half-pound or 4-ounce kind of quantities to dispense to patients. But it's delicious. Each one of those herbs complements the other flavor profiles as well as just the medicinal virtues. But let's just stick with chamomile for the moment. Chamomile is a wonderful anti-inflammatory for the intestinal mucosa or any of the digestive mucous membranes, even as a mouthwash for gingivitis or any kinds of oral cavity inflammation, or when somebody has GERD, that's gastroesophageal reflux disease, where stomach acid is coming up into the esophagus. And a common reason for people to use Tums to antacids to the proton pump inhibitor types of pharmaceuticals. It's excellent for irritable bowel. It's excellent just for your run-of-the-mill gas and bloating, somebody that has a dairy allergy but indulged in some ice cream at a party or something like that. Drinking a few cups of that tea in a row can often work very quickly in the span of 30 to 60 minutes or so for intestinal cramps, diarrhea, gas, bloating. It also is wonderful for healing ulcers, an actual peptic ulcer, duodenal ulcer, or lower bowel ulcers. Those can be more challenging cases of colitis or ulcerative colitis, for example. And you might think something as simple as chamomile is not up to the job of treating ulcerative colitis, but it's actually a wonderful tool, and in your whole protocol, it can be very helpful. So I've really relied on chamomile, especially as a tea. We have it in our tincture collection. I find I'm rarely using it in that form because I prefer it in the liquid form of a tea. And also, of course, if you're drinking a tea, you're going to get the benefit of surface contact with the mouth, with the esophagus. If you drink 2 or 3 cups of it in fairly rapid succession, you can even kind of fill up your stomach with it for at least 20 minutes or so. You can have a whole volume of chamomile tea down there that has the ability to touch the surface digestive mucosa within the gastric membrane, and then it will get passed on to the small bowel and ultimately the large intestine, and it's soothing all the way down. And so licorice is a great complement when there's ulcerative lesions, because licorice is known to increase the ability of the body to produce mucus that protects our mucous membranes. We make mucus out of little teeny goblet cells. They're called that because it's exactly what they look like. If you look with a microscope at the intestinal or any mucous membrane, histologically, you can see these little mucus secreting glands that look like little cups full of wine, little goblets that are secreting mucus that are coat and protect the surface membranes of our gastric mucosa. So licorice is a great complement for ulcerative lesions, whether it's an infection like traveler's diarrhea or whether it's an autoimmune disease like some type of colitis. Fennel is a carminative agent. That means it dispels gas and bloating. And so chamomile and fennel are great for just any kind of feeling of discomfort. Sometimes when people are really gassy, it can come up as burping, irritation. Sometimes it can go the other way as flatulence, or sometimes it's just stuck in the belly and feels really uncomfortable, that drum-like tightness of the belly. And that's kind of what infants seem to have as colic. And this is safe even for babies. It's just hard to get it into babies, nursing infants. So you give it to a nursing mother. So a little bit is passed through the breast milk. Or you can even soak a cloth in chamomile tea and add a drop or 2 of fennel essential oil and put that over the belly of a baby. Or just anybody, again, with more run-of-the-mill flatulence, dyspepsia, just an uncomfortable, gassy tummy. And then mint in that formula is another carminative agent, meaning to dispel gas and bloating. And mint is available as essential oil. It's available as tinctures. It's available as pills. You can get those enteric-coated pills you swallow that are mint essential oil that kind of makes it through your stomach acid and opens down in the intestines. But again, teas are such a beautiful and inexpensive way to get some of those medicines down into the gut, into the intestines. And so chamomile and mint together are wonderful for nausea. That could be motion sickness and seasickness. People that get queasy following chemotherapy. It even can work as a kind of anti-nausea tool that's due to a drug side effect, or really any case of nausea. Those are worth a try. So those are just the ace in the hole digestive herbs: chamomile, mint, fennel, and licorice. So we've been making our tummy tea that way for decades, and it's tasty. So even children can enjoy it if they're prone to getting a tummy ache because they ate too much junk food at the friend's birthday, or they're prone to getting digestive upset when they're irritable, cranky kids. The chamomile will somewhat calm children down so that they can go to bed more readily, or just hand them a cup of tea while you read them the bedtime story. There's such versatility to those simple culinary herbs, and they're virtually tolerated by nearly everyone. And they're safe to use with pharmaceuticals. They're safe to use in infants. They're safe to use in elderly. So it's a great all-purpose tea that's based on the wonderful chamomile, Matricaria chamomilla.
Wow, I already love chamomile, and now I'm just like, gosh, it just does so much. And I love that this tummy tea is just so tried and true. Like, we don't have, I mean, your books are bringing a lot of formularies to the forefront, but we really in Western herbalism don't have the extended tradition of these formulas that, say, traditional Chinese medicine does. And so I love these like tried and true formulas. Like, yes, I've been using this for decades. It's amazing. Um, I have a couple of questions for you. One, I'm curious because you have extensive clinical practice. How often do chamomile sensitivities come up? Like people just, they can't tolerate chamomile because they have maybe a similar aster family allergy.
I think it's rare. So I can think of one time in 35 years, and it wasn't really a side effect from ingesting it as much as it was from handling the dry herb that just liberates pollen and gave somebody itchy eyes, itchy kind of hay fever like symptoms. And in that case, I think a person could still consume it if somebody else made the tea for them and handed them the cup of tea. There's no pollen left once you've strained it out. It's different chemistry. Once it's kind of brewed, you're not getting pollen in the aerosolized way in sensitive mucous membranes that triggers an allergic phenomena. So I think it's very rare. Those aster family plants are, for the most part, fairly benign for most people. So in my experience, reactions to chamomile are very infrequent.
All right, it's good to know. I do hear that from time to time, from listeners that, that for whatever reason that the chamomile doesn't work. But it's interesting to hear just like that limited amount of people you've come across in your extensive experience.
Yeah.
Well, hearing you talk about chamomile from like your everyday like bloating and flatulence to like helping with nausea after chemo, or helping with all like colitis, like ulcerative colitis, just like the incredible impact it can have on there. It reminds me of something I was reading about in your books, where you talk about the difference between pharmacologic therapy and physiologic therapy. And I was wondering if you would share a little bit about those differences.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great concept to consider when you're treating patients, or just to consider the virtues and the place where herbal medicine fits in creating health for people. So I consider pharmacologic and physiologic as kind of on a continuum. And there's some herbs that we do want for their pharmacologic like effect. So pharmacologic, you can think of the word like pharmacy, or to have a pharmacologic substance is a drug like effect. where something that's physiologic is aimed at restoring and repairing and supporting normal physiology. So sometimes an example of a pharmacologic therapy might be a steroid. A person's inflammatory response is so overboard or so pronounced, or they can't breathe and you need a steroidal inhaler. They have itchy eczema and they just want to suppress it with a cortisone cream or something like that. You're relying on a drug-like effect of a steroid to override what your body is doing and just kind of squash that down. In this example, squash it down, suppress it. In some other examples, somebody that has narcolepsy, that can't drive because they would fall asleep at the wheel, you might need an amphetamine-like effect. And then that would be an example of using a pharmacologic agent to really stimulate somebody more powerfully than a cup of coffee would. Somebody with severe narcolepsy maybe takes stimulants their whole life. Those are just obvious examples of a pharmacologic effect. And then, of course, most pharmaceuticals are having a pharmacologic effect, whether it's an antibiotic to kind of kill a microbe, a bacteria, a virus, a fungi, or it's a steroid, or it's an anti-inflammatory drug, or it's the over-the-counter Tylenol, acetaminophen, those NSAIDs, just to kind of inhibit the enzymes that give us headache, give us joint pain, help us mount a fever. Whereas a physiologic substance is something that is not going to interfere with your body's normal physiology. It's not going to suppress it like a steroid. It's not going to stimulate it like an amphetamine. It's not going to block it like an NSAID, whether it's fever or pain. But slowly and more gently, you restore and support normal physiology. So your physiology could be a bit sluggish because you're old, because you have hypothyroidism, because that's just your constitution, and you want to do gentle things that stimulate bile flow and support cell reproduction and unburden the organs from the stress of just fats or things accumulating, and you just support normal physiology with liver herbs, with alternatives, with a high fiber diet, with exercise and sweating, or you can do physiologic therapies in ways apart from herbs as well, like heat and saunas and exercise, or fasting in some cases. Or somebody's physiology might be a little bit too ramped up and they're having panic attacks and they can't shut their mind off and they're fidgety and they can't focus. And we want grounding things that kind of help calm down a edgy nervous system. But we don't want to sedate the person. We're not using downers and barbiturates. We might use meditation as a non-herbal therapy. We might use things that decrease hyperexcitability of ion channels to put a molecular mechanism that we know about, like kava is kind of drug-like, so we could almost put it in the pharmacologic camp. If somebody had an acute pain or acute panic attack, you could use kava, but I wouldn't really say that's using herbs in a physiologic way. You could use chamomile, our favorite choice of today, and that might not be powerful enough to halt an immediate panic attack. But if you take chamomile every day, you might have less panic attacks by the end of the week and certainly by the end of the month, because you've normalized that physiology. And we do know that chamomile affects GABA in the brain. That's gamma aminobutyric acid. That's where Valium, for example, binds, the benzodiazepine category of pharmaceuticals. But it does way more than that. And that's one of the beauties of herbs. We don't just use herbs because they're like Valium. Chamomile also soothes the gut, and we might have more panic if we have leaky gut, or we might have a more agitated nervous system if we have inflammation in the body. So herbs can work in so many multiple mechanisms at once, and often they do so in a gentle manner that restores normal physiology. And so the point of physiologic versus pharmacologic is not just to treat every disease or every problem that comes along with a pharmacologic kind of big gun tool, but instead support a person's normal physiology such that pretty soon they don't have to rely on medicines any longer. Their own body is better optimized and their metabolism is supported, their organ function is supported, their nervous system is supported, and they're made healthier. They're made more regulated and stable in their homeostasis, meaning your ability to respond to stresses, your ability to right yourself. And all of us have moments in the day where you might have to swerve out of traffic and it's going to cause an adrenaline surge. Somebody pulled out in front of you in traffic and you need that momentum, that oomph to have a fast reaction time. Or there's other points in the day where you get a bee sting and you have to calm down that inflammation. So there's always those little challenges, and part of a healthy organism is to be able to respond to those challenges, like ramp up your adrenaline or ramp up your inflammation, and then you did the job and you calm right back down to a state of physiologic balance. So we want in naturopathic medicine and herbal medicine is to help people's physiology be optimal, to be able to continually right ourselves when we're exposed to different sort of stressors and challenges, and calm right back down to a state of ease. We can sleep well at night. We have good energy during the day. Our immune system can respond, whether it's a bee sting or a virus. Our nervous system can respond, whether it's a kind of an emergency or just getting our own ability to drive ourselves to accomplish great things without exhausting ourselves or becoming a nervous wreck. And that's kind of a challenge you come across a lot in clinical practice, people that can't meet all those challenges, and for good reason. My gosh, this world can be a lot, whether it's your jobs and your finances, your children, your neighbors, your taxes, your keeping your house cleaned up, taking care of your in-laws, your parents, your wayward brother. I mean, the world has its stressors, and my own clinical practice has kind of been a 35-year-long parade of hearing people's stories about how that exhausts them, gives them headaches, gives them back pain, makes them not sleep well, suppresses their immune system. And so the whole practice of herbal medicine is often using physiologically appropriate medicines to build up the immune system, to decrease the jagged edges of a nervous panic attack, so that we can have this physiologic balance. Chamomile is great for that. Adaptogens are great for that. Alternative herbs are great for that. Many of the nutritive herbs like gotu-kola and equisetum and nettles, just kind of our food-like plants that help repair and regenerate connective tissues. So we have so many different types of tools that are physiologic within our herbal medicine toolkit, that we only have to rely on things like kava or taking a Tylenol just now and then, if we really choose that that's what this body needs for a pharmacologic effect. Or maybe you need an antibiotic now and then, or maybe if you can't breathe, you need a steroidal inhaler now and then. But the goal of our therapy as we work together over time would be to need that Tylenol less and less, or need your steroidal inhaler less and less, because your own body can kind of keep in balance, more physiologically balanced over time.
Oh my gosh, that was just an incredible explanation of those, and just really highlights the complexity of one being a doctor or an herbalist, and matching people to those resources there. Also, where my mind went, Jillian, is I was thinking about like how with pharmacological medicines, you explained kava could be one, for example, but when we think about like pharmacology, like actual pharmaceutical drugs, those tend to be very simplistic in nature in that they're very like single focused. they're like a dagger going in, doing a very simple focus thing. Whereas herbs are just so incredibly complex, and they're having this physiological reaction within our body. And something I see that's interesting that happens is that people, when they first start learning about herbs, they often might want to know, like, what is that one thing? Like, what is the one constituent within chamomile that does this thing? Or just recently, somebody asked me, what is the one nutrient found within angelica that builds blood? Like, what is the thing that does that? And when you were giving that really wonderful explanation, I just kept thinking, like, they're just so complex, and they're acting with our own body to have a physiological experience. And so sometimes we can say, oh, we do know that this particular constituent plays a big role in this plant's function, but it's never the constituent, right? It's never the one thing. It's the complexity of the herbs, and not only the complexity of the herbs, but how they interact with our body. Like you're saying, this physiological response that's helping us to do all the things that you explained, whether it's like nervous system regulation or helping our bodies, be able to just adapt to change in the way that you explained it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in herbs, you're so right that they're a vast collection of a number of different active molecules or chemical constituents. And you're right that we have identified something like apigenin as a flavonoid in chamomile that contributes to anti-inflammatory effects, or matricine is another component of chamomile that's antispasmodic to the smooth muscle of the stomach lining and things. So you can study up on those things, but I guarantee you that science will mature and we'll find another one and another one. Or sometimes we find that they only work in tandem. You can try to pluck one of those chemicals out and make it a superpowered, almost prescription-like extract, and then we find it never worked as well as that molecule left in its whole plant matrix. Like, nature is wise in combining the flavonoids with the enzymes, with the trace minerals, with the resins, with the alkaloids. And it's often in conferences, the people that are pharmacists or that are really following the drug model that ask the questions like, what is it that's the blood tonic in angelica? And when you say, well, it's probably these 10,000 compounds, that it's almost a deer in headlights, like, oh my gosh, it kind of rocks people's worldview once they kind of realize how complex plants are. And the state of research right now in herbal medicine can really take you down some rabbit holes, and you have to be nerdy to kind of like that or to go there. But it's almost like a game you play or a little puzzle to solve, because there's so many different types of studies you can do. There's tissue culture studies. They can induce disease models, like induce a type of colitis in a rat, or try to produce some type of neurodegeneration in animals. It's really kind of cruel and sad, but that is the state of the research at the present time. And then you can pre-treat or post-treat with the whole plant, or pre-treat or post-treat with just a single molecule out of plants, and see if you prevent that neurodegeneration, or see if you can rescue animals in a stroke model, or see if you can heal the intestinal mucosa in a colitis model. And then even kind of further down the rabbit hole, let's just stick with the colitis idea. We know that there's certain inflammatory molecules that are greatly increased in many of those immune modulation disorders, like tumor necrosis factor and NF-kappa B and these interleukins. And it gets so complex in a hurry that you can see that, oh, it increases this enzyme, or it increases this type of inflammatory mediator. And that is said to be the evidence of how it's working. And then sometimes you'll read in another book, well, that's contraindicated in lupus, right? Because people with lupus already have that tumor necrosis factor too high, or they already had that one type of interleukin that's already excessive, and we found that St. John's wort, or we found that licorice increases that, so that's contraindicated. And it just drives me nuts sometimes, because that's not at all the truth of what the whole plant does. They might have just plucked out one molecule, created this disease model, looked at one isolated molecular constituent, and then somebody makes the leap and says, so then we don't use it in XYZ conditions. And that's often only a tiny little slice. That's like looking at the world through the tiniest little pinhole and trying to apply it holistically. Because in many cases, you can study those very same herbs and they will lower. This goes beautifully with our physiologic action of herbs, is that in many cases, the very same herbs that increase cortisol when it's too low will be the same herbs that decrease cortisol when it's too high. And that's maddening to the pharmacologic thinkers. Like, what? How is that possible? It really is. They optimize. They take both poles of sort of disorder, the hyperfunction and the hypofunction, and they tend to be able to restore normal physiology. And another common example of that is we find some herbs like echinacea that might improve immune response. So then people say, well, then they're contraindicated in autoimmune diseases, right? And like, no. Many cases, you can still take echinacea for your strep throat or something if you have lupus. They're not absolutely contraindicated. And one that there's a lot of research on in that regard is astragalus. Astragalus is used widely in Chinese medicine as a qi tonic and immune modulating agent. And we find it being used to boost your immune system if you have low immunity and you're getting colds and flu and infection all the time, or having a long recovery period, like a long convalescence till your lungs are all the way better, your energy is all the way better from a bronchitis or a pneumonia or some kind of infection. And so people will say, well, then you can't take that if you have an autoimmune disease, right? And like, no, there's actually lots of published studies on astragalus for allergic phenomena and decreasing hypersensitivity reactions, or normalizing some of those immune markers that are too high in a state of autoimmune reactivity, normalizing or optimizing or restoring normal physiology. And so the adaptogens, astragalus, medicinal mushrooms have lots of research on how they can work at both poles and be a physiologic medicine and restore and optimize that homeodynamic ability to regulate ourselves, whether it's too low or too high. They're physiologically appropriate. And so you are so right about the kind of Angelica comment, or just trying to identify the one active molecular constituent. And some plants might even have different constituents that do the opposite in them. Like some of the cardiac glycosides, some stimulate the heart rate and some slow and strengthen the heart rate. And it's not like we want to pick which one is the best. When we use all of those cardiac glycosides that are present in the whole convallaria or digitalis, they tend to tonify heart action. And when we just take the digoxin out only, or the digitoxin out only, then we have a little narrower therapeutic window of how we can use that safely, because it has a more harsh or kind of unipolar effect. But plants left with all of their sum total of all of the different molecules and all of the different chemical constituents in general tend to be nourishing, regulating, optimizing, tonifying, and have a physiologically restorative effect.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I'm going to be referring so many people to this podcast for years to come. I know, because you've shared so much, and that's so important. And I feel like every other week it's another herb that kind of falls into that area of, like you said, echinacea went through it there with autoimmune disease. I remember when ashwagandha was vilified for a while for thyroid, different thyroid functions. Lemon balm is a really great example of that too.
Yeah.
Elderberry went through it for all sorts of reasons. So anyway, yeah, it's going to keep happening to herbs, because like you said, it's just the way humans want to like wrap their brains around something, even though it's not how the herbs actually are working. So thank you so much for all of that. And thank you for sharing so much about chamomile. Thanks for this tummy tea recipe. People can download a recipe, the full recipe card. That's beautifully illustrated at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com or looking at the show notes. And before we go, I just have a couple of more things for you. One, I know that you're leading ethnobotany courses, and I would love to hear more about that.
You bet. It's kind of my current passion, besides the garden, of course. It's always the eternal passion. But once my children were grown and I knew a lot of the herbs in my own neighborhood, I wanted to take some athletic vacations and hike the Inca Trail, and Machu Picchu always called to me every time I ever saw a photo of it. And so one year, I think over 15 years ago, I decided to buy a ticket and go do it. And on that first trip to Peru, after I hiked the Inca Trail, I had a few more weeks before I had to head home, and I wanted to go see the Manu jungle. And I absolutely loved it. I didn't have a whole lot of exposure to the tropics really in my life. I'd been to Asia and some of those jungles, but I didn't know the plants well. And so I went for just a touristy kind of experience and saw the jungle and the bugs and the birds and felt the warm, moist air and so on. And I wanted to go back and do it again. And I wanted to study with some people that really knew those plants. And so I approached the Amazon Conservation Association, who was doing work in the area to try to maintain the forests and maintain the animal habitat. And they offered some financial incentives to some people to not cut down the trees just for quick money. And they had some relationships with some of the tribal communities, some of the indigenous communities that lived in the Manu Basin. And I approached them to say, I'm really looking for an herbalist. I don't just want to study from a book. I don't just want to study somebody's PhD thesis that flew down for a few months or a year and study the plants, published their dissertation and flew home. I want to learn from people that have lived there for their whole lives, learned from their grandparents and so on. And they allowed me to tag along with them to their next trip to study with the Wachaperi. Well, in the ensuing 25 years, I've become fabulous friends with the Wachaperi, who started teaching me the herbs upon request, and I pay them, and I've become good friends with them, and I support their own work and their own community and their sustainability and their capacity to kind of keep their traditional life. I've also studied with the Matsagenga, with the Yagua, with the Bora, and I was very studious about it at first. Like at first for a decade or so, I would take studious notes and I would try to look up the plant names, and I would record things with a video camera, and I would formally make oral history transcripts and archive them, and spent hours and hours in my months at home back in the US. It was a way that I improved my Spanish, just listening to those transcripts over and over again and realized words that I didn't catch well, figured it out. Or often the tribal communities only know the plant in their tribal name, very rarely the scientific name. I'm good enough with plant families that I could sort of guess. I bet that's in the Solanaceae family. I bet that's in the Meliaceae family or Anacardiaceae family. And then I would go to the Field Museum's website, who has a online archive of, again, people's PhD theses or different kinds of projects where they have plant family photos. And so you can type in something like tropical, Solanaceae, yellow flower, Peru, or something of that sort, and just get pages and pages of photos. And I would scroll through and often find the plants. Sometimes I wouldn't find it after hours of scrolling through and looking at photos, and then think, well, maybe that's not that family. Maybe it's this family, and then start all over again. So it's kind of a lengthy process that, again, I spent 10 years on, just making my notes be better and better, or finding the Latin names for plants. And then once I for sure had an identity of a genus and species, then I would go back to PubMed and see if there's published papers, chemical constituent studies, Any clinical research, any trials? Is it used in other countries? Is there a similar species that's in Brazil or in Ecuador? And just, nerded out once again on just searching out those plants. Anymore, I'm not really trying that hard at it. I just have fun. And it just evolved into my making wonderful friendships and going back year after year, studying with the same people over and over again. I would realize sometimes once I got home that they were pointing at a big tree, and I failed to ask, are they talking about the bark of this tree? Are they talking about getting the leaves? Or the fruit when they fall to the ground? And I would go back yet again and say, last year you showed me this tree. Is it the bark? No, just the sap. Oh, okay. And then just year after year. And so now I have a smattering of herbal knowledge. I don't think I'll ever be super duper in my recognition of all the plants of that beautiful vast jungle contains, but I know enough to just share my enthusiasm and my rudimentary knowledge with students. And so it's led to me leading ethnobotany field courses. Currently, we're doing this every January, and we meet in Cusco, Peru, and we study the Andean plants for several days, and then we take a week-long journey to go down to that Manu Basin. It's one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, and we pass through many ecosystems in a single day. It's a fascinating journey where we start at about 12,000 feet up in the Andes and kind of go down into the Sacred Valley, and then up over one more high pass, and then you pass down through the cloud forest, down, 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 and we end up by dinner time in the tropics. So it's a marvelous journey, and we spend many days with the Huachapiri people, and we look at their farming techniques. We go on herb walks in the forest. We do some of their traditional crafts, just like textiles and basketry and dye plants. We can do some of their tobacco snuffs and rituals and storytelling and spiritual bathing, and a number of the mythological and spiritual traditions of the area. And there's plenty of time for eating good food and singing songs. And then we go back up to Cusco and kind of have our closing celebrations and meeting with a few more people up in town. So all in all, it's a marvelous 10-day trip. Anyone is welcome to join who thinks that sounds like fun. We've had some of my patients have come along. The spouses of some herbalists have come along and I think enjoyed themselves. Some older teens have accompanied their parents. And so anybody who thinks that sounds like fun is welcome to contact me. Just at Dr. Jillian Stansbury, just all spelled out as one word, Dr. Jillian Stansbury at Gmail, and I can put you on the ethnobotany mailing list, or my own website, Battleground Healing Arts, has a little page devoted to the ethnobotany field course that I lead every January.
Wow, I had no idea you were doing that, and to the extent of the relationship you had with people down there. That just sounds absolutely amazing, like, so amazing. What an opportunity. Um, yeah,
I
thank you
love
so
it.
much for sharing that. Yeah, and, when people hear about this and then they go on the trip, I wanna hear about it. So be sure to tell me when, for all of you listeners out there, what it was like. Because yeah,
Okay.
wow, it's incredible. Well, my last question I have for you, well, first of all, just thanks again for
Yeah.
sharing so much of all of this. It's just been incredible to hear from you and just, yeah, just generously sharing so much of your expertise. And before you go, I have the last question, which is what new things or skills are you currently cultivating with herbs?
Yeah. I want to focus more on using herbs in food-like ways, and not just the culinary herbs. I guess that's a given. Of course, using rosemary and thyme and garlic and paprika and all of those in your daily diet, I think it's very healthy for us. Plus, it just makes life grand to have all those aromas and smells and colors and flavors. But I would like to flesh out my own website. I've devoted more time to scholarly article material in my blog than recipes. And I've kind of been promising people, watch this page, coming soon. And it's kind of been parked there for a few years. And I'm going to be devoting a few more pages and time to using heart tonics, using mushrooms, using some of the concentrated nutrients, things for lowering your cholesterol, ways to get high fiber, just where can you put apple pectin in your daily diet, or where can you get pomegranate juice into a beverage or something. Just those fun kinds of inspiring tools, so that not everything needs to be a tincture, a tea, a pill. How can we inspire the patients, the public, the community to get some of these wonderful health effects just from a few simple daily tonics? It might replace your coffee habit. It might replace your alcohol after a hard day's work. It might replace a dessert with something healthier, just to kind of dabble with those fun, healthy, inspiring recipes. And of course, the colorful photos need to be used to inspire people.
Oh, well, that is something I'm super passionate about, so I'm excited to see what you come up with.
You're great at that, Rosalee. I should.
It is like you said, I love the idea that we can just incorporate those things into our normal life, so it does become normalized. And like you were saying, like, I love the idea too of like, how do we move, like, it's great to use basil and oregano, obviously. How do we get other herbs into our life? And especially like interesting ones. Like, I was at the Botanicals at the Beach conference a few years back, and they were serving food to everybody, and they made an eggplant dish with echinacea, which it was interesting, right? Like, because you had the tingle going on. I mean, it wasn't like overpowering, but it was definitely like, I don't know. I've just thought about that sense of like, how else could we incorporate, things into our food that you just wouldn't expect, So yeah, I'm excited to see this come from you. Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful.
Well, it'll probably be a little at a time, because it's almost the gardening season upon us here in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know when your listeners will hear this podcast necessarily, but this is our first sunny weekend that we've had. We're at mid-March, and it's supposed to be a warm, sunny weekend. So it's not going to be at my computer this weekend.
Well, with that in mind, I'm all about getting you out of here so you could go enjoy the sunshine, go enjoy your garden. Thanks again so much for being here. This was just a fabulous chat, and I'm just so grateful.
Well, it's wonderful to talk with you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to head over to the show notes at herbswithrosaleepodcast.com to download your beautifully illustrated recipe card and to get a transcript of this show. There you'll also be able to sign up for my weekly newsletter, which is the best way to stay in touch with me. You can visit more of Dr. Jillian Stansbury's offerings at battlegroundhealingarts.com and healingartsapothecary.org. If you'd like more herbal episodes to come your way, then one of the best ways to support this podcast is by subscribing on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I deeply believe that this world needs more herbalists and plant-centered folks, and I'm so glad that you're here as part of this herbal community. Also, a big round of thanks to the people all over the world who make this podcast happen week to week. Nicole Paul is the project manager who oversees the whole operation, from guest outreach to writing show notes to actually uploading each episode, and so many other things I don't even know. She really holds this whole thing together. Francesca is our fabulous video and audio editor. She not only makes listening more pleasant, she also adds beauty to the YouTube videos with plant images and video overlays. Tatiana Rusikova is the botanical illustrator who creates gorgeous plant and recipe illustrations for us. I love them. I know that you do too. Christy edits the recipe cards, and then Jenny creates them as well as the thumbnail images for YouTube. Michelle is the tech wizard behind the scenes, and Karen is our student services coordinator and customer support. For those of you who like to read along, Jennifer is who creates the transcripts each week. Xavier, my handsome French husband, is the cameraman and website IT guy. It takes an herbal village to make it all happen, including you. And one of the best ways to retain and fully understand something you've just learned is to share it in your own words. With that in mind, I invite you to share your takeaways with me and the entire Herbs with Rosalee community. You can leave comments on my YouTube channel, on the herbswithrosalee.podcast.com show notes page, or simply hit reply to my Wednesday email. I read every comment that comes in, and I'm excited to hear your herbal thoughts on chamomile. Okay, you've lasted to the very end of the show, which means you get a gold star and this herbal tidbit. So Dr. Stansbury mentioned that chamomile is gentle enough for an upset belly, but is also being used for patients undergoing chemo. It's really an amazing plant. So here's an interesting study about that, the chemo part. The title of the published paper is Chamomile Infusion Cryotherapy to Prevent Oral Mucositis Induced by Chemotherapy. In this study, patients were split into two groups. One group was given cryotherapy made only with water, and the other cryotherapy made with chamomile infusion. The results were that the occurrence of oral mucositis was lower in patients in the chamomile group than in the control group. When compared to the controls, the chamomile group presented less mouth pain and no ulcerations. Cryotherapy was well tolerated by both groups, and no toxicity related to chamomile was identified. So here you go. Yet again, we've confirmed on this podcast that chamomile is absolutely incredible. Cheers.